my colleagues Leslie Witz and Gary Minkley and I have been working on a project about South African history and the politics of public history in South Africa over a number of years. And one of the arguments that we make in our book, Unsettled History, that is coming out in the next few weeks from the University of Michigan Press, is that South Africa is marked by the fossil complex. Because an element of South Africa's modernity as a new nation at the beginning of the 20th century and the events leading up to the formation of the Union of South Africa, and in the decades thereafter, the South Africanization of science and the projection of South Africa as a scientific new nation, as a new nation with scientific capacity, was essentially marked by the living fossil, where South Africa is deemed to be the home not just of the history of the earth and its people in deep time, contained in the stratified layers of the earth, but that in South Africa the fossil was still living. And there are at least 3 examples of what has been referred to in South African science as living fossils. And here we're interested in how disciplines have emerged and have gathered around the idea of the living fossil, marked essentially by the coelacanth, the coelacanth, as well as the cycad, and thirdly the bushman. Because one of the arguments about the scientific interest in what was called the bushman body was the understanding that the bushman, the cycad, and the coelacanth were these remarkably still living examples of species that had died out and that had become extinct, or that were on the verge of extinction and thus needed preservation. And so one of the elements of the fossil complex is, how does a settler state make its argument for its right to exist? And it does so through the argument of preservation. And so the irony of heritage is that the idea of heritage is colonial in its very conception, and that those who take upon themselves the duty of preservation of species and of these examples of humanity who are simultaneously pre-human, who are simultaneously non-human, who are simultaneously natural history, who do not know how to care for themselves and are about to disappear, these fast disappearing races of mankind, and it is the duty of certain people to do that preservation. And so when you think of what lies at the basis of the colonial order in South Africa, and I call it colonial even though you're talking about an independent South Africa, because colonialism does not just refer to a certain political state of being under formal colonial rule, but colonialism is a knowledge order. Colonialism is a history of collecting. Colonialism is the division of the world through certain kinds of disciplines that still mark the university and the museum in a country like Germany as it reinvents itself through 19th century knowledge forms. And in South Africa, the irony is that this fossil complex reproduces itself right through until the democratic order. So that as part of the making of a new democracy that is also scientific, you still have all of this fascination and interest in hominids, with South Africa declaring itself to be the cradle of humankind and to be caring for the history of the earth and the prehistory of the earth. And it's the very same arguments. And so one is not interested in the fossil as object. One is less interested in that than one is interested in the fossil as a discourse, as a way of knowing, and as a way of understanding society and the world. My work, of course, involves the dead that lie in South African and European museum collections. And these are the dead from Southern Africa who were alive at the beginning of the 20th century and who lived lives usually as farm workers or as shepherds or as members of the rural poor in the Trans-Garib region between southern Namibia, Botswana and the Northern Cape, and who possibly spoke Southern San languages like Mu, and who by the 20th century had been separated from the land, turned into farm workers, and on whose death and on whose burial by their people had their bodies stolen, disinterred illegally by grave robbers, who then sold these remains mostly as bone, sometimes boiled down to bone from corpses on the spot, but often in a couple of cases also sold, acquired as corpses. So my interest is in the history of Bushmanization, of the scientific interest and for the purposes of racial science and racial research of the Bushman body, and the ways in which these scientists, anatomists and paleoanthropologists were simultaneously interested in the Bushman body as well as in the anatomy of hominids. And these were exactly the same scientists. So I'm interested in the relationship between the idea of Southern Africa, South Africa being the site of the origins of human beings in an evolutionary sense, and the racial research that was taking place on the Bushman body. And so of course, this was research on fossils that were related to the remains of recently dead people whose relatives are still alive, also in some way referred to as fossils that were still living. And so, of course, the fossil emerges from the earth because of its layers. The very idea of the fossil is in the concept of the earth turned into stratified layers of time. Most recently, the hominid research has identified an ancestor, if you may call it that, called Homo naledi, extracted from a cave by very slim researchers who were dramatically able to climb into the cave and to extract these remains of hominids who, it seems, were not only bipedal, in other words, they stood up, but the argument is that they buried their dead. So this is a mark of culture, if you like. Now that research is ongoing. So it's interesting that you're interested in the idea of burial. and the politics of burial. Because burial is not just the placing of the corpse into the earth. Burial is a cultural act. Burial is an act of community. Burial is an act of family. Burial is an act of attending to the dead body in a respectful manner. Whatever religious framework you operate in, there are histories of burials in the Northern Cape that are of a cultural nature. There are burials where people are buried sitting up. People are buried with grave goods. In the case of the burials that I research, these were burials of people who were Christianized. And so they are burials that are significant because they also involved an illegal disinterment and an acquisition by some of the leading museums in South Africa and in Europe of stolen remains. And so what do you do with stolen remains? What is the process that occurs with the buried dead body regarded as the remains of Bushmen, racialized, objectified, typologized? How does one undo those events? And the process that has the South Africans went through with the return of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar from Vienna was referred to as rehumanization. Because what happens when these remains enter the museum is they become objects. Not only because museums have objects. Museums don't have humans, they have objects. So there's a necessary process of the rendering of the human as object. Of course, what then happens when you are able to determine names, you're able to determine biography, you're able to determine family relations, and you're able to determine living relatives of people whose bodies and bones lie in museums. And particularly in a society such as South Africa, when these museums are going through a process of democratization, to bring them in line with a non-racial democracy. What is the task of the museum? What do you do? How do you have to reorientate yourself? You have to turn your back on colonial disciplines. You have to turn your back on racial science. You have to find a new ethics of belonging. You have to be able to make that museum meaningful to everyone in the society. And so you have to, that process of rehumanization needs to be one that takes place in deep consultation with local people in order to ensure that one brings respect and closure to the dead whose spirits wander the earth and are not at rest. And at the same time, this is not just the making of an ethical museum, it is changing the museum itself. You know, I mean, Germany is a very interesting society at the moment. Let me speak like an outsider who has spent a little bit of time in Germany, mostly in Köln, a little bit in Mainz, a little bit in Berlin, engaged in discussion with colleagues in the museums and in the universities about changing museums. German museums are at a very interesting stage because, like South Africa, Germany is a society that is remaking itself. It wants to be a modern European country. It's European, wants to be Western. It is renegotiating its relationship with the rest of the world. It has a very strange relationship with its colonial history because of the peculiarities of how that colonialism was structured in societies like Namibia. So when Germans hear you saying colonial, they think you're talking about a particular category of crime. And they immediately think it's another accusation, that colonialism means genocide, means Nazism, means genocide, means this, means that. And it's a litany of these terrible deeds that mark Germanness in an essence. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that. It's not just crime that has to be attended to, involving the mass murder of people in a society such as Namibia. But it involves how German society and its institutions and its museums were marked by colonialism, marked by colonial disciplines, so that these disciplines, the disciplinary arrangement and the disciplinary division of the world that you find in German museums and German universities is essentially a colonial order of knowledge. These are 19th century disciplines that do not exist in the same way any longer in other societies. And so, to think that Germany has one person employed in a Geschichte seminar as historiker, as historian, only one, is just, it's unthinkable when you have this mighty discipline of African history that has developed in other parts of the world. Of course, in history departments, in Germany you have people who study African history, but only for the purposes of studying German history overseas, of doing empire history, of studying imperial history, overseas history. They do not study African history. You study African societies in an anthropology department. And sorry, not anthropology, ethnology. Because anthropology is that term limited to physical anthropology. And so and in fact, Africa is turned into a discipline. It's not an area study, it's Afrikanistic, in the same way as the world is divided into Orientalische Kunde, Indologie, Sinologie. The system of heritage and the modern museum and its collections management today is very much able to incorporate the opinions of local people and indigenous people, and sometimes under the name of shared heritage and partnerships, but purely as an element of cultural resources management, of ensuring the participation by stakeholders, so that you have a more informed understanding, a more informed system of collections management, and exhibitions that come across as slightly more enlightened and that have multiple voices. And it seems as though what you have is an undoing of past colonial relationships, but in fact you don't. That what you have is an incorporation into the old museum without fundamentally unsettling the discourse of discovery and preservation, and of the old institutions taking it upon themselves to do the caring of the collections on behalf of the rest of humanity, albeit in a slightly more enlightened way through partnerships. But everybody knows their place, and you have your set designation, and you don't leave that. This is the scientist, that's the expert, that is the indigenous person, and you all enter according to your role in the list of opinions in order to create the balanced perspective of shared collections. And okay, so what you have there is a politics of representation that is underway And you can't withdraw from that process because it's an ongoing process of negotiation. Now, the trouble is that the curators and the directors are threatened sometimes by the process, who understand that as fundamentally asking for the return of things. And I'm less interested in the return of things than I'm interested in changing the museum itself. And changing the questions that we ask about collections. Because for me, the museum is not the collection and the museum is not the display. The museum is the process itself. That is the terrain of the new museum that we must advance. And we have to do so inside of the debate, and we have to do so by building the resources of the new museum, precisely whose shape and whose direction and whose orientation is still not clear. We are at a time of the heightening of arguments about the museum, and our task is to ensure that that debate is a productive one.